The horrors of Nazi concentration camps are etched into history as some of the most grotesque acts humanity has ever committed. However, these camps represent only a fraction of the atrocities carried out by the Nazis. Textbooks often gloss over the unspeakable acts that occurred in SS castles, or the twisted experiments conducted by the man who was dubbed the Angel of Death. Perhaps some horrors are so unimaginable that our minds struggle to comprehend them fully. These are the 15 horrifying Nazi facilities, even worse than the concentration camps. Number 15. Josef Mengele's facility. In the dark recesses of Auschwitz, Poland, Josef Mengele, infamously known as the Angel of Death, carried out horrifying medical experiments on prisoners. His facility within the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp became a place of unimaginable suffering.
50 years ago, at a railroad siding at a killing field called Auschwitz,
often eclipsing the horrors of the gas chambers themselves, Mengele was obsessed with genetics, particularly the study of twins. He would greet incoming trainloads of prisoners, gleefully separating twins from the masses. These innocent children, many as young as 5, were subjected to vile experiments. Mengele performed unnecessary surgeries without anesthesia, injected chemicals into their eyes in a cruel attempt to change their color, and deliberately infected one twin with a disease to see if the other would be affected through transfusion.
A German SS officer named Josef Mengele, Dr. Josef Mengele,
when one twin died, Mengele often killed the other to compare their bodies. The accounts of survivors are chilling. Dr. Olga Lengyel, a prisoner at Auschwitz, described how Mengele supervised the birth of a child with disturbing tenderness, only to send both mother and child to the gas chamber within the hour. Another prisoner, Dr. Gisela Perl, witnessed Mengele performing horrific experiments, noting how he would whistle joyfully after killing or maiming his subjects, as though it were a job well done. One account speaks of Mengele tearing a newborn from its mother and throwing it into an oven simply because it was not a twin. Mengele's facility was a grotesque playground of pseudoscience, where human life was reduced to nothing more than a test subject in his warped pursuit of genetic purity. His victims were dissected after death, and their bodies were sent to Berlin for further study. Twins, dwarfs, and those with physical abnormalities became the focus of his twisted fascination. For many, death was a cruel release from the unimaginable torment of his experiments.
Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. He was a notorious Nazi doctor.
Number 14. Hadamar Euthanasia Center. The Hadamar Euthanasia Center, located in Hadamar, Germany, was a site of unparalleled horror during the Nazi regime. It was part of the T4 program, an initiative designed to eliminate those deemed unworthy of life by the Nazis. Over 14,000 people, including the mentally ill, disabled, and other vulnerable groups, were killed here. The center's atrocities rivaled even the brutal conditions of concentration camps, as victims were murdered with cold efficiency.
This is Grafeneck Chateau in Baden-Württemberg in southwestern Germany. It was one of the locations of the National Socialist regime.
The program began in 1939 under the guise of mercy killing. Patients at Hadamar were first selected by medical staff and sent to the facility, often by bus or train, under the pretense of receiving treatment. Upon arrival, they were led to what appeared to be shower rooms, but were, in fact, gas chambers. Pure carbon monoxide was used to kill these individuals, whose bodies were then cremated. The staff would celebrate each grim milestone, such as the 10,000th death, with macabre parties. Even after the gas chambers ceased operation in 1941, the killings at Hadamar continued more covertly through drug overdoses and starvation. The facility remained operational until March 26, 1945, when U.S. Army units liberated it. Upon entering, the soldiers found over 500 patients starved and on the brink of death, the result of systemic neglect and targeted malnutrition. Despite receiving care, many of these patients succumbed to the effects of their mistreatment shortly after liberation. The immediate post-liberation investigation led to the arrest of key staff members, including Irmgard Huber, the head nurse. Huber played an integral role in the killings, selecting patients for murder and falsifying death certificates. Number 13. Mittelwerk, Nordhausen. Mittelwerk, near Nordhausen, Germany, stands as one of the darkest chapters of World War II, even surpassing the horrors of some of the concentration camps. This underground facility, housed in an old gypsum mine within Konstein Hill, became the production site for the infamous V-2 rockets after the Royal Air Force bombed Peenemünde in August 1943. Mittelwerk was not just a factory, it was a death trap for the thousands of prisoners forced to work there under inhuman conditions. By mid-1943, the site transitioned from a fuel depot to a rocket manufacturing hub under the control of SS Brigadier General Hans Kammler, a man notorious for his role in constructing extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. The workforce consisted primarily of concentration camp inmates, drawn from a subcamp of Buchenwald known as Dora. Prisoners worked deep underground in the stifling, dangerous tunnels, suffering from constant rock falls, exhaustion, and brutal beatings by the guards. The conditions were horrifying. Inmates were crammed into lice-infested bunks, forced to live and sleep within the tunnels themselves, and deprived of basic sanitation, running water, or any real medical care. Many worked on precarious scaffolding, only to plummet to their deaths as their strength failed. Those who perished were frequently loaded onto trucks and sent to Buchenwald for cremation. Between 1943 and 1945, tens of thousands of prisoners labored at Mittelwerk, with estimates suggesting that 26,500 died, either through sheer exhaustion, starvation, disease, or outright murder by the SS. The tunnels, over 1 million square feet in size, served as a vast, grim assembly line for the Nazi war machine, turning out V-2 rockets and Junkers aircraft engines. For the prisoners, however, Mittelwerk was not just a factory. It was a slow and torturous death sentence. Number 12. Wewelsburg Castle. Wewelsburg Castle, located in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany, holds a chilling reputation far beyond an ordinary SS stronghold. With a history dating back to the 17th century, the castle's triangular layout made it unique, but it was its transformation under Heinrich Himmler during the Nazi era that truly cemented its dark legacy. Himmler, head of the SS, envisioned Wewelsburg as more than just a headquarters.
As I see it after a month of research, this Nazi castle is indeed
obsessed with mysticism and occult practices. He sought to turn the castle into a spiritual center for his elite SS officers. He believed the nearby Teutoburg forest, where Germanic tribes famously defeated the Roman army centuries earlier, held historical significance for the Aryan race. Wewelsburg Castle, nestled in this ancient landscape, became a symbolic place for Himmler and his SS, a space where they could forge a connection to the supposed grandeur of Germanic warriors. To actualize his dream, Himmler had the castle stripped of its modern plaster and transformed it to reflect a medieval fortress, complete with a moat. However, this massive rebuilding project came at a gruesome cost. From 1939 to 1945, a concentration camp was established at the site, housing nearly 4,000 prisoners. Forced laborers were made to work under inhumane conditions, and over 1,200 of them perished due to the brutal treatment they received.
whenever there's no evidence for a statement made in the literature, I will indicate it in the lower left corner.
Inside the castle, Himmler constructed eerie spaces like the crypt and the Supreme Leader's Hall. These rooms were steeped in occult symbolism, with artifacts like the Black Sun symbol, which many conspiracy theorists have since claimed was used in secret SS rituals. Although historians remain skeptical of these claims, the mythos surrounding Wewelsburg endures, fueled by post-war rumors and the lack of concrete documentation. After the war, Wewelsburg Castle became a museum in 1982, dedicated to educating the public about the horrors of the SS. It remains a stark reminder of the twisted ideology that drove the Nazi regime, a place where history and legend intersect, casting long shadows over the past. Number 11. Fort Breendonk. Fort Breendonk, located in Belgium, stands as one of the most horrific sites of Nazi brutality during World War II, yet it remains a largely forgotten chapter in history. Originally built by the Belgian army between 1906 and 1913 to protect Antwerp, it played a defensive role during World War I. However, following Belgium's surrender to Germany on May 28, 1940, the fort was repurposed by the SS as a detention and torture facility for resistance fighters, political prisoners, and Jews. Though Fort Breendonk held far fewer prisoners than infamous concentration camps like Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, its conditions were among the worst.
So we're starting out the morning here at Breendonk concentration camp. We're still in Belgium. We're not too far from Antwerp right now.
Around 3,600 prisoners passed through its gates, of whom 300 perished within the fort, and 185 were executed. Others were sent to larger camps like Auschwitz, where they met their fates. The fort's terror was administered by German SS guards and Belgian collaborators, making it a feared place of unimaginable cruelty. Prisoners arriving at Breendonk were subjected to immediate dehumanization. They were forced to stand motionless in the courtyard, facing a wall, under the threat of severe beatings if they moved. Torture and executions were routine, and prisoners were often forced to witness the deaths of their fellow inmates, instilling terror in their hearts. Commandant Philipp Schmidt and his wife, along with other sadistic guards, routinely beat prisoners, unleashed dogs to maul them, and subjected them to unrelenting physical and mental torture. The fort's notorious torture chamber still stands today as a stark reminder of the SS's cruelty. Prisoners endured unimaginable torment, from being suspended by their arms until their shoulders dislocated, to being beaten with pipes while hanging from meat hooks. Other methods included thumb screws, head clamps, and electrocution, while some were even burned with hot pokers. The room was designed with a gutter to drain the blood and urine of prisoners who lost control during their torture.
A former Nazi concentration camp guard has been given a 2-year suspended sentence during World War II.
The infamous standing cells confined prisoners to an upright position for days or weeks, driving them to the brink of madness. Forced labor was another grueling aspect of life in Breendonk. Prisoners were made to work 12-hour days, 7 days a week, hauling soil in harsh conditions to build fortifications. Malnutrition, exposure, and disease were rampant, and prisoners were housed in overcrowded, unsanitary barracks with poor ventilation. Jews, segregated from others, received even fewer rations and were often housed in the most abysmal conditions. By the time the camp was liberated in 1944, fewer than 10% of its prisoners had survived. Those who did were left scarred for life by the horrific experiences they endured. Number 10. Gusen I and II. Gusen I and II were subcamps of the notorious Mauthausen concentration camp in Upper Austria, representing one of the darkest chapters of the Third Reich's brutal history. Known for their backbreaking labor, starvation, and extreme cruelty, these camps were infamous for their brutal conditions, which claimed thousands of lives. Though lesser known than Auschwitz or Treblinka, Gusen was a living hell where prisoners were worked to death in stone quarries, munitions factories, and other industries essential to the Nazi war effort. The prisoners at Gusen, initially largely Polish, faced a grim fate. Overcrowded and starved, they toiled under constant threat of beatings, execution, and disease. The average life expectancy of an inmate in 1940 was only 6 months, and many prisoners weighed as little as 40 kilograms. Epidemics, notably typhus, ravaged the camp, further exacerbating the misery. Gusen's guards exhibited cruelty of an unspeakable nature. One notorious figure, Capo Wolf, would execute prisoners by hanging them and then desecrating their bodies. Others participated in the systematic extermination of inmates through various means, including a gruesome execution method known as the death bath. Victims were forced to stand under freezing water for hours until they succumbed, often drowning when the drains became clogged. Among these horrors, a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of Father Johann Gruber, who became known as the Saint of Gusen, a Catholic priest. Gruber was arrested by the Nazis for his vocal opposition to their regime. While imprisoned at Gusen, Gruber risked his life to help his fellow prisoners. He smuggled money into the camp, bribed guards, and distributed food to those on the brink of starvation. His acts of heroism saved countless lives, and he even managed to establish a small school for Polish children within the camp. Tragically, Gruber's efforts were discovered. After being brutally tortured for 3 days, he was hanged by the SS as a warning to others. His body was displayed publicly, falsely labeled as a suicide by the Nazis. Today, Gruber is remembered as a symbol of resistance and humanity in one of history's most horrific places. Number 9. Struthof-Natzweiler. The horrors of World War II are synonymous with concentration camps, but the Struthof-Natzweiler camp, located in the Alsace region of France, stands out as a particularly brutal facility. Perched on the north slope of Mont Louise at 2,400 feet, this camp served not only as a place of forced labor, but also as a grisly laboratory for some of the war's most inhumane medical experiments. Originally, the prisoners were sent to Struthof-Natzweiler to mine granite, a task aimed at beautifying German cities. But as the war dragged on, the focus shifted. Prisoners, who came from over 30 different countries, were forced into labor for the Nazi war effort. Among them were members of the French resistance, Jewish people, homosexuals, Roma, and Sinti. Throughout its dark history, Struthof-Natzweiler held over 52,000 prisoners, with a peak of 7,000 at one time. The conditions were savage. Many inmates succumbed to starvation, disease, and brutal treatment from guards. What made Struthof-Natzweiler worse than other concentration camps was its role in medical experimentation. The camp became a living hell for its inmates as Nazi doctors conducted horrific experiments on diseases like typhus, as well as exposure to toxic agents like mustard gas and phosgene. Inmates were subjected to these gases in torturous studies meant to further Nazi military science, leading to excruciating deaths for many. The camp's gas chamber was another site of atrocity. Here, 89 Jewish men and women were murdered at the behest of Dr. August Hirt, a Nazi scientist at the Strasbourg Institute of Anatomy. Their bodies were intended to be used for a grotesque study of racial differences, adding a further layer of horror to the camp's legacy. In September 1944, as the Allies advanced, the Nazis evacuated Struthof-Natzweiler, transferring most prisoners to Dachau. A month later, the camp was liberated by the 3rd U.S. Infantry Division, but its legacy of unspeakable cruelty endures in history as one of the war's darkest chapters. Number 8. Mittelbau-Dora, Nordhausen. Mittelbau-Dora, also known as Dora Mittelbau or Nordhausen, was a Nazi concentration camp located near Nordhausen in Thuringia, Germany. Established in 1943, it was originally a subcamp of Buchenwald, but eventually became a separate camp in 1944, primarily used for the production of the deadly V-2 rocket. The facility was notorious for its inhumane conditions, which claimed the lives of tens of thousands of forced laborers, including political prisoners, Jews, and others. The camp was designed around the Mittelwerk, a vast underground factory hidden within the Harz Mountains. Prisoners were forced to live and work in brutal conditions, carving out tunnels and assembling V-2 rockets in damp, cold, and poorly ventilated spaces. The tunnels were often filled with dust and fumes, leading to respiratory diseases and other illnesses. Thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, or disease. Many others were executed for being too weak to work. Unlike other camps, the living conditions at Mittelbau-Dora were particularly horrifying. Prisoners were housed directly within the tunnels, without access to fresh air or sunlight. The cramped quarters, lack of sanitation, and constant noise from the machinery made it an unbearable environment. Roll call was held twice daily, where prisoners had to stand motionless for hours, often in freezing conditions. Those who collapsed or failed to comply were subjected to severe punishment, including beatings, torture, and execution. Psychological torture was also a key element of the camp's terror. Screams from tortured inmates in nearby prison cells were deliberately broadcast to the rest of the camp to break the spirits of the prisoners. The crematorium, a grim reminder of death, constantly operated to burn the corpses of deceased inmates. Inmates were forced to carry the bodies of their dead comrades to the crematorium, further dehumanizing them. Number 7. Mauthausen Quarry. Mauthausen Quarry, located in Mauthausen, Austria, was a site of unspeakable horror during World War II, arguably surpassing even the brutal conditions of many other concentration camps. Known as the Wiener Graben, this granite quarry was used by the Nazis for their grand architectural projects, including Nazi monuments. However, for the tens of thousands of prisoners forced to labor there, it became a symbol of relentless suffering and death. The quarry's most infamous feature was the Stairs of Death, a set of 186 steep steps carved into the rock. Inmates who were already weak from starvation and overwork were forced to carry massive blocks of granite, some weighing up to 50 kilograms, up these steps repeatedly throughout the day. The stones often outweighed the prisoners, many of whom were barely 40 kilograms due to malnutrition. Accidents were frequent and deadly. A single stumble could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction, causing prisoners to fall onto one another, breaking bones, or crushing those below them. The guards, known for their cruelty, treated this suffering as a sport. They would whip and beat prisoners to force them to work faster, and they even placed bets on which inmates would make it to the top. SS guards like Irma Griese, Joseph Kramer, and Amon Goeth patrolled the quarry, often executing prisoners on the spot for the slightest infraction or failure. Prisoners were also subjected to sadistic games, such as the parachutist's wall. In this sickening ritual, inmates were forced to choose between pushing another prisoner off the cliff or being shot themselves. For the prisoners of Mauthausen, death was a constant presence. The camp had a staggering death toll, with over 90,000 lives lost. Many perished not through conventional executions, but by being worked to death in the quarry, their bodies broken under the weight of the stones and the relentless cruelty of their captors. Mauthausen remains one of the darkest symbols of the Holocaust, a place where human life was reduced to nothing more than a means to an end. Number 6. Peenemünde Army Research Center. The Peenemünde Army Research Center, located in Peenemünde, Germany, was a site of both technological innovation and human tragedy. Established in 1936, Peenemünde became the center for the development of Nazi Germany's V-1 and V-2 rockets, with Werner von Braun at the helm. While von Braun's genius eventually helped propel humanity to the moon through the Apollo missions, his work at Peenemünde was built upon a foundation of unimaginable horror. Peenemunde's sprawling complex included research facilities, rocket launch stations, ports, and construction halls. However, behind this scientific facade lay the darker reality of the forced labor that powered its operations. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners were brought to Peenemünde to assemble the infamous V-2 rockets under brutal and inhumane conditions. Many of these prisoners were interned in makeshift camps on site, including one in the basement of a construction hall. These forced laborers, subjected to unspeakable cruelty, faced malnutrition, disease, and constant abuse from their captors. It's estimated that around 20,000 of them died due to the horrid conditions at Peenemünde, more than the number of civilian casualties caused by the rockets themselves. The V-2 rockets, which were initially hailed as marvels of military technology, ultimately claimed more lives during their production than in their actual use. Peenemunde's legacy is one of profound moral contradictions. It was known as the cradle of spaceflight because the first object built by humans to reach outer space was a V-2 rocket launched from there in 1942. Yet, this achievement is marred by the immense suffering of the prisoners who built those rockets. Peenemünde was worse than many concentration camps. By the time Peenemünde was evacuated in 1945, the site had been bombed by the Allies, and thousands of forced laborers had perished. This place of human ingenuity became a symbol of how technological advancements can be entwined with the darkest aspects of human history. Number 5. Hitler's Führerbunker. Hitler's Führerbunker, located in Berlin, Germany, was far from an ordinary underground hideaway. It was the symbol of the end of one of history's darkest chapters. This reinforced, subterranean maze of claustrophobic rooms buried beneath the Reich Chancellery served as Hitler's final headquarters during the last months of World War II. It was here, in this dim and oppressive environment, that Hitler directed the dying Nazi war effort, issued his last orders, and ultimately took his own life. While the Führerbunker was not directly a site of mass murder like the concentration camps, it represented the command center for the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime. From this underground shelter, decisions were made that led to the suffering and deaths of millions of people across Europe. The bunker's walls bore silent witness to Hitler's madness, as he desperately clung to power even as Germany crumbled around him. Life in the bunker was bleak. With its thick concrete walls, the air was stale, the lighting harsh, and the atmosphere damp from the ever-present moisture that seeped through the cracks. Hitler, paranoid and fearful of drowning if the bunker walls gave way, was said to dress fully and even shave whenever bombers were overhead. The Führerbunker's corridors became a twisted labyrinth of despair, a prison for Hitler and his closest followers as they awaited their inevitable defeat. In this dismal setting, far removed from the grand halls of power above, Hitler's regime met its bitter end. Number 4. Gross-Rosen. Gross-Rosen, located in Rogoznica, Poland, was one of the most brutal forced labor camps of World War II. Originally founded in 1940 as a subcamp of Sachsenhausen, Gross-Rosen was notorious for its extreme cruelty. The camp's prisoners, initially used to construct the camp itself, were soon forced to labor in SS-owned granite quarries. The harsh conditions, long hours, and inhumane treatment led to the camp's reputation as a place of unimaginable suffering, even compared to other concentration camps. By 1941, Gross-Rosen became an autonomous concentration camp and grew rapidly, transforming into a massive industrial complex. The camp became the hub of a network of at least 97 subcamps, and by 1945, over 76,000 prisoners were confined within its system. Nearly 26,000 of these prisoners were women, most of them Jewish. This marked Gross-Rosen as one of the camps with the highest concentration of female prisoners. As the war escalated, so did the demands of the German armament industry. Gross-Rosen became a critical site for forced labor, while Gross-Rosen subcamps expanded to house the growing number of detainees. From October 1943 to January 1945, a massive influx of Jewish prisoners swelled the camp's population, many of them deported from other forced labor camps or concentration camps like Auschwitz. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners were literally worked to death, and relentless abuse from their captors. The Gross-Rosen quarries in particular became sites of agony, where the labor was so intense that survival was nearly impossible for many. Number 3. SS-Sonderlager Hinzert. SS-Sonderlager Hinzert, located in Rhineland-Palatinate, Germany, was a nightmarish facility that stood apart even among the horrors of Nazi camps. Originally established in 1938 to house workers constructing the West Wall, it quickly evolved into something far more sinister. After burning down in August 1939, it was rebuilt in October of the same year as a police detention and re-education camp, intended to punish and correct workers deemed antisocial by the Nazi regime. But its true purpose would soon be revealed as a site of unparalleled brutality. By 1940, Hinzert became a prison for political prisoners from occupied Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. These prisoners were subjected to unspeakable cruelty in the name of re-Germanization, or under the guise of protective custody. In February 1942, the camp came under the control of the SS Central Office for Economics and Administration, further cementing its role as a site of terror. Hinzert now served as a prison for the Gestapo of the Luxembourg and Trier areas, and its inmates faced constant torment at the hands of SS guards known for their sadistic brutality. Many prisoners, ranging in age from 13 to 80, were subjected to horrifying tortures, with countless numbers executed on the spot. The camp operated with grim efficiency, its structure mirroring that of other concentration camps, complete with a kommandantur, a political section, a detention and security camp, a medical unit, and guard units. However, following the arrival of night and fog prisoners, those who disappeared into the Nazi system without a trace, the camp's political section was shut down, and the true extent of its horrors intensified. Despite its partial destruction by an air raid in February 1945, Hinzert remained operational until March of that year. Many prisoners were forced on death marches. Over 13,600 political prisoners had passed through Hinzert between 1939 and 1945, many of whom never made it out alive, leaving behind a legacy of unparalleled suffering. Number 2. Skoda Works. Skoda Works, located in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, became one of the darkest chapters of Nazi occupation during World War II. This once proud facility, a leading armament producer before the war, became a hub of forced labor and misery, surpassing even the horrors of some concentration camps. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938, Skoda Works fell into Nazi hands. The German Luftwaffe heavily bombed the facility, deeming it a critical military target. As the Czechoslovak resistance crumbled, the remaining workers, unwilling to support the German war machine, sabotaged the factory, destroying vital technical information. However, the Nazis rebuilt the facility, transforming it into a centerpiece of their armament production. Workers endured brutal conditions, with little food, constant beatings, and exposure to toxic chemicals. For the Nazis, the facility's production was too important to slow down, and the factory churned out weapons and tanks vital to their war effort, regardless of the human cost. One of the ironies of the Skoda Works story was the production of Czech tanks. These tanks had been developed by Czechoslovak engineers before the war, but after the invasion, the Germans lacked the technical blueprints to continue production. German engineers had to reverse engineer the designs, and by the time they succeeded, the rebuilt Skoda Works was producing these same Czech tanks for the Nazi army. Even during the invasion of the Soviet Union, these Czech tanks played a role, though their origin was a bitter reminder of Czechoslovakia's lost freedom. Number 1. Kummersdorf. Kummersdorf, officially known as the Heeresversuchsstelle Kummersdorf, or Army Testing Facility, was one of Germany's most secretive and horrifying weapons development sites. Located near Berlin, this facility's reputation surpassed that of even concentration camps in terms of the human suffering inflicted. Established in the late 19th century, Kummersdorf was at the heart of German military innovation, particularly during both World Wars. It was a vast complex where the latest artillery, tanks, and even rockets were developed and tested. The facility's most notorious legacy came from the experimentation with advanced and experimental weapons. It was here that some of the deadliest technologies were first tested, often with devastating results. One of the most harrowing aspects of Kummersdorf was its use of forced labor. These laborers were considered expendable, and many died during these tests. Whether assembling volatile explosives or serving as unknowing subjects for horrific experiments, their lives were treated with indifference. Some were used in tests where they were directly exposed to weaponry under development, resulting in horrific injuries or death. Do you think there are still undiscovered Nazi facilities hidden across Europe, holding secrets that could rewrite history? Let us know your opinion in the comments below.